Hi, it's Heather from Thicketworks, and today I want to show you the method I've created for making these miniature roses. Now, the first thing I want to say is that creating miniatures does not come naturally to me. It's incredibly challenging to work at such a small scale, but with a few tips and tricks, it's definitely doable. If you have a small flower punch, then by all means you can use that. I used the Cricut Maker and this SVG file that I'm making available to you for free. The process begins by creating bespoke paper from which to cut our flower petals. I'm using tracing paper for this. It's very lightweight, it's semi-translucent to begin with, and once we add our DIY vellum technique, which you see me demonstrating here, it becomes even more translucent and durable at the same time. This lightweight DIY vellum is created by saturating the fibers of the paper with baby oil and then adding translucent pigments in the form of spray inks. Now, any translucent pigment that you have on hand should do well. You could try using watercolors, distress inks, or distress stains. Just make sure that you tint both sides of each piece of tracing paper. And once they've dried, it's important to iron out all of the wrinkles created by the moisture. I sandwich each piece between two clean pieces of copy paper and then press them with an iron on the highest setting, set to no steam. You can see just how translucent this material is, but it also has an oily residue, so make certain to use a good quality matte sealer on both sides of each page. This will make it possible for your DIY vellum to stick to your cutting mat for the delicate cutting process. I experimented with many different mediums in an attempt to create the same level of translucency as baby oil, because like you, I'd prefer not to have an oily residue on my DIY vellum. And the results of all my experimentation are, yes, baby oil wins hands down. I had no other substance available to me that created this kind of transparency. I also chose to use a matte spray sealer so that there would be a slight differentiation between the shininess of the foliage and the soft, quiet, matte finish of the rose petals. Once your paper is thoroughly dry, it's time to take it to your electronic cutter. I provide all of the necessary settings in the accompanying blog post, but here is just a brief overview of the process. I like to tape down the edges of this delicate paper just to ensure that it doesn't begin to peel up during the cutting process. It takes approximately 14 minutes for this particular cut file to complete, and it yields about 135 pieces, which in my experience can result in the creation of over 30 individual rose buds and full-blown flowers. The next phase of the process is to use the second SVG file that I've created to cut out many tiny rose leaf clusters. This is done using the copy paper weight DIY vellum that was first used in order to create miniature ivy leaves. This same material is perfect for the creation of these tiny clusters of rose leaves. It takes approximately 35 minutes for this cut file to complete, and it will yield 108 individual leaves and 117 of the little sprays of rose leaves. More than enough to provide ample foliage for your miniature roses. The next phase of building our miniature roses depends upon having believable calyxes, so there's an additional SVG file free of charge for you to download and cut again from the copy paper weight of the DIY vellum demonstrated in the miniature ivy vines tutorial. This file takes about 22 minutes to fully cut, and it will yield 50 separate calyxes and an additional 54 leaf sprays. As a bonus, you'll get a few more individual rose leaves that can be scattered around your environment to help create a believable garden. I just love the variegated colors and the translucence of this paper. Now, there are some pretty nice mulberry miniature roses available for inexpensive prices on Amazon. And rather than go to all the trouble of creating your own miniatures, I thought you might want to see them compared side by side with what we're creating today. The handmade rose comes in at about half the scale of the commercial version, and the delicacy is quite pronounced when you compare the two. Additionally, the translucence of the petals and the addition of the foliage makes all the difference. This is what convinced me to develop this process for creating miniature roses. Now that we have all of our paper components, it's time to take a look at the other items we'll be using. I chose to work with 22 gauge green floral wire, some seed beads, and to set out my materials in a relatively organized fashion so that I can easily grab both the petals, leaf sprays, and the calyxes. I've set up a container and a toothpick so that I can easily dispense Aleene's Fast Grab tacky glue. The first step in this method is to create a center around which to build the flower. Dipping the end of the flower stem into the Aleene's tacky glue allows us to pick up one of the seed beads. Then we can immediately add a tiny drop of super glue at the base of the bead, and then harden and solidify that glue immediately by applying a little bit of baking soda over the top. I recommend beginning with this process because that hard bead will create an armature of sorts around which you can force the petals of the roses to furl naturally. And speaking of petals, it's time to begin. The first method I'll show you results in an open-centered miniature rose. Use a ball stylus to round out each of the individual petals, and then flip the piece over and create an indentation in the center. Pierce through the center of the petal form with the sharp tip of the craft wire. Slide the petal form up the stem. Apply adhesive, and then press the base of the petals against the bead. This results in an open center rose. To create a closed center rose, round out an additional set of petals. This time, simply cup the first layer and then twist it around the bead to create what looks like a tiny rosebud. Then continue to layer the open flower petal shapes until you're happy with the fullness of your bloom. Use as many or as few layers of petal forms as you like. But whether you're building a single rose bud or a fully formed flower, make certain to add a calyx around the base. Form the calyx using the same method we used for the rose petals. Round out each individual leaf, flip the piece over and create an indentation, and then slide it up around the base of the flower. Once the calyx is in place, you may want to tease a little more liveliness into the edges of the rose petals by using a fine-tipped pair of tweezers to help shape individual petals. Now it's time for the tricky part, and that is attaching the leaves. Use the ball stylus to round out the upper leaves, but leave the lower ones free and flat This is where we will apply our adhesive and then press your flower stem against the leaf form until those two little leaves bend upward toward each other, and you can glue them together, creating a sort of leaf sandwich. Here's a closer view of the process. Yeah, you get adhesive on your fingers. There's no way around it. But it's a secure join, and it allows you to actually slide the leaves up and down the stem until you're happy with the configuration. Don't worry, we're going to go through all of the processes again, speeded up. Yes, this process requires a great deal of patience. It's an excellent opportunity to catch up on listening to your favorite podcast. It's the compound curves that we create in each petal form by using the ball stylus to curve the individual petals in one direction, flip the piece over, create that central indentation that we can then pierce through with the sharp tip of the flower stem. It's these little nuances that help create a feeling of believability. And the whole process starts with the translucent paper. If we were to use regular cardstock or copy paper for the petals of the roses, they wouldn't have nearly the delicacy that these do. So I do encourage you to give the lightweight DIY Vellum a try, whether you are using a paper punch or an electronic cutter to create your petal forms. The same transparent vellum process can be used for just about any kind of flower petal that you would like to create, from daffodils to daisies. And by switching it up, by using the copy paper weight vellum for foliage, you get that nice juxtaposition between the delicacy of the petals and the more solid form of the foliage. It's these tiny little touches and distinctions between materials that make my heart sing and that have caused me to fall deeply in love with the creation of miniatures. I'll admit, I was really intimidated by the idea of trying to create roses on this scale that would actually please me and not look, I don't know, out of scale or awkward somehow. But it was that feeling of intimidation that led me to experiment with many different options, and that finally got me to the place where I can share this process with you, confident in the knowledge that it will work to help you bring your miniature garden to life. And if you can improve on this process, so much the better. But at least this way, you have the foundation for approaching the creation of miniature flowering plants. And that is a good thing. See, I'm awkward with my hands, and it is not easy for me to work at this tiny scale, but with a little bit of repetition, it all fell into place, and it will for you too. And that is how to create miniature roses. If you'd like to take it a step further, join me for the creation of these French Tuteurs, or freestanding trellises on which you can place your roses. These two are created on the Cricut Maker using a specific brand of lightweight chipboard. There'll be a link in the description for the exact materials that I've used here. This particular cut file takes about 25 minutes to complete. It will result in the creation of 8 individual shapes, and those shapes are placed together in such a way to create 4 individual Freestanding Trellises. It's really cool. So let's take a look at how it's done. Once the cut file is complete, it's important to carefully remove the cut pieces of lightweight chipboard from the mat. Now, I love working with cut files and electronic cutters, but this is definitely my least favorite part of the process. Once all of the interior cuts have been removed, though, you get these pieces here, and they're designed to fit together through these slots at the top and the bottom of each of the shapes. It's important to be gentle with this chipboard. It is very lightweight. We will strengthen it at a later point in the process, but for now it's still quite delicate. However, you should be able to slide the two pieces together and then join the tip at the top with some super glue. Hold it in place for a few seconds until it has an opportunity to bond firmly, and then flip the piece over and repeat the same process at the very bottom of the trellis work. Once the top and the bottom have been firmly adhered, it should be stable enough for you to continue the hardening process. Make certain that you've opened a window or are wearing a respirator, because the fumes from superglue can be pretty nasty to deal with. Hardening the chipboard is as simple as applying a thin layer of liquid superglue on all sides of the object, and then allowing it to dry. This allows us to use an easy to cut material like this incredibly thin chipboard, and yet have a piece at the end of the day that's very sturdy and will withstand handling for years to come. For yet another variation on garden structures, I've created an additional SVG file for you. This one to create trellises that are meant to stand against a structure like the wall of a house, or in the case of the secret garden, the walls of the garden itself. I'll be using the exact same lightweight chipboard that was used to create the Tuteurs, but this time we won't need to harden the material with superglue. Instead, we'll be using a layering method to create strength and durability. The trellis cut file takes about 25 minutes to complete its operation and will result in 8 individual trellis shapes. I like to use a very thin-bladed but sturdy palette knife to help lift the edges of the chipboard and then peel the rest away by hand. The palette knife also comes in handy when attempting to remove each individual trellis shape without leaving messy bits of chipboard on the mat. When you've cleared away all those interior offcuts, you'll be left with a pile of little rectangles, and those can certainly come in handy for other projects. This file was designed as a mirror image. It's not perfectly symmetrical. That means there's a right and a wrong way for this to go together. Coat one side with a good quality PVA glue, and then match up its mate so that all of the apertures are nice and clear. Place some weights over the top and allow them to dry. Once they have dried, it's time to add a base coat. I chose to use Rust-Oleum Ultra Cover in satin in an espresso brown color. I allowed that to dry, and now I'm applying a layer of cheap hairspray over the painted surfaces and letting that dry. Next, I'm coming in with a cheap white acrylic craft paint and applying a messy layer over the top using a brush. Once this surface has thoroughly dried, I'll be coming back in to create a sort of weathered, shabby effect over the top using a toothbrush and a lot of water. The surface of the chipboard is protected. The layer of spray primer will help to keep the chipboard from disintegrating, as we use the water and scrubbing motion of the brush to create a deteriorated painted effect. And now it's time to start applying our do-it-yourself miniature roses to the trellises and to the other structures that we've created. A pair of needle nose pliers comes in handy, and so does super glue, so that you can apply additional sprays of rose leaves anywhere you would like to give this a fuller effect against the background of the trellis work. Use the pliers to help condense the wire into shapes that appear as though the rose canes have grown through the structures over the years. And don't be afraid to add little dots of super glue wherever you would like things to remain permanent. It takes surprisingly few of the roses to create a really lovely effect. Adding lots of leaves over the top of the vines and the structure helps to fill everything out. The weathered paint finish on the trellis work helps to create the atmosphere of the secret garden, a place that's been long neglected but is coming slowly back to life. These delicate 1/12 scale roses can go a long way toward creating an atmosphere of vintage romance for your scale modeling, your dollhouse projects, or your dioramas. I had a wonderful time developing and presenting this particular tutorial. The story of the secret garden reminds me of how important it is to cherish the connections that I have with other people. The fact that you've taken the time to watch this video today is something that I don't take lightly, and for which I'm very grateful. Thank you. Until next time, bye.